Good afternoon. We are pleased to welcome a national and global audience, those of you who regularly attend our events and those of you who are participating today for the first time. We welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Tiffany Rasmussen. I'm the Director of the Office of Professional Excellence here at the Columbia School of Social Work, also known as OPE. And today's panel, the 2020 elections, post-elections debrief, holding space and moving forward, is the first of a three-part series we're going to be offering over the upcoming couple months here. It's organized by OPE, the Columbia School of Social Work Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the Social Work Action Lab for Social Justice. Let's see, our hearts and goals for the series is to facilitate conversation that's going to help all of us navigate through processing the election's results and the aftermath, having a deep understanding of the implications that these results will have on key issues that matter to us and matters to the communities that we serve and work with. And also just moving forward in our personal and professional commitments of hopeful action. So we invite everyone to respectfully participate in the chat and Q&A boxes. We are going to reserve time at the end to answer as many questions as we can that you may have for the panel. So we ask that you put those in the Q&A box so that we can keep track of them. And then separately throughout the discussion, you are welcomed to share your thoughts, reflections, any resources that you may have for other attendees via the chat box. Actually, we both welcome and encourage this as a way to further connection and foster community. So when you're typing in the chat box, you will have the option to select panelists and all attendees if you want your comments to be seen by the larger audience. In fact, if you have not already done so, we welcome you to type into the chat box, introduce yourselves. We'd love to know who you are and where you're joining us from. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dean Melissa BEGG. Dean BEGG became the 18th Dean of the Columbia School of Social Work on September 1st, 2019. Dean BEGG is an accomplished scholar, she's an accomplished scholar, committed educator, and a creative administrator, leader. Her work has focused on convening interdisciplinary teams and developing innovative curricula, creating mentorship programs, and enhancing diversity in graduate education and the research workforce. She's deeply committed to the school's social justice mission and the pursuit of better science for a better society through scholarship, education, practice, and collaboration. So with that, I'm pleased to turn over the camera and the mic to Dean BEGG.
Thank you, Tiffany, and thanks to everyone in our audience for joining us for today's post-election panel discussion. The focus of this panel and the others in the series to follow in the coming months is on the broad implications of the 2020 election, with a special focus on racial equity, the economy, healthcare, criminal justice reform, and social unrest. I would like to express my special appreciation to our guest panelists today, Professor Esther FUCHS, Professor Bradley Hardy, and Professor Susan WITTE. Thank you for generously giving of your time and expertise. I know we're all very excited to hear from you. Now, before we get started, I'd like to say a word about the Columbia School of Social Work. Our school places social justice and racial justice at the center of all that we do. We study and are uniquely attuned to the consequences of policies and practices that engineer and sustain inequities. The school's faculty, students, and staff work in opposition to these forces to promote well-being across all strata of society and to ensure that all can reach their full potential. Social workers understand from long experience that the main obstacles to well-being are structural and systemic, that they are enacted through our social and economic policies. Social workers witness the consequences of problematic policies every day. They understand, furthermore, that policies must change. And they know that the way to change policy is to change the policy makers through elections and through voter engagement. Social workers, given their commitment to social justice and advocacy, are uniquely positioned to raise awareness, mobilize for action, and increase voter engagement. The stakes are really high, as can be seen in this most recent election. Our voices matter, your voices matter, and votes give voice to the will of the electorate. On that note, please allow me to take a moment to recognize the extraordinary efforts of our students and faculty who led the school's nonpartisan Social Work Votes campaign, working hand in hand with other critical voter engagement initiatives, including the Latino Leadership Institute and the National Social Work Voter Mobilization Campaign. They worked truly tirelessly to train, organize, and mobilize to support our communities in exercising their right to vote for elected officials who will share their values and will best represent their interests. At this point, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce my esteemed colleague, Dean Karma Lowe. Dean Lowe is the School of Social Work's inaugural Assistant Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. During her tenure in various student-facing roles at the school over time, she has been a beloved mentor to student advocates who shared a passion for extending diversity and inclusion practices at the school. Under Dean Lowe's leadership, the DEI office provides a wide range of programming and community building efforts for students experiencing marginalization. Dean Lowe, I'm delighted to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dean BEGG and Director Rasmussen. It's quite a gracious introduction, and I am delighted to be able to moderate today's conversation with our esteemed guests, Drs. Esther Fuchs, Bradley Hardy, and Susan Witte. So I'm going to offer just some brief introductions of our panelists, and then we're just going to dive right in. Dr. Esther Fuchs is a professor of international and public affairs and political science and is director of the Urban and Social Policy Program at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Previously, Professor Fuchs served as chair of the Urban Studies program at Barnard College and Columbia College, and as founding director of the Columbia University Center for Urban Research and Policy. Professor Fuchs is also a member of the Faculty Steering Committee of the Eric Holder Initiative for Civil and Political Rights and the Provost Just Society's Task Force at Columbia, among many other distinctions within and outside of the university. Currently, she serves as director of the whosontheballot.org, an online voter engagement initiative for New York City. Professor Fuchs is an expert in urban politics and policy, American politics, and American parties and elections. Dr. Bradley Hardy is an associate professor of public administration and policy at American University, where he also serves as department chair. He's a non-resident senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution, a research fellow with the Center for Household Financial Stability at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, and a research affiliate of both the University of Wisconsin Institute for Research on Poverty and the University of Kentucky's Center for Poverty Research. Dr. Hardy's research interests lie within labor and applied microeconomics with an emphasis on economic instability, intergenerational mobility, poverty, racial economic inequality, and young adult socioeconomic outcomes. He's also interested in the changing role and the impact of government tax and transfer programs such as SNAP, food stamps, and TANF on a range of socioeconomic outcomes, including poverty, income instability, and intergenerational mobility. Dr. Susan Witte is a social worker and associate professor at Columbia School of Social Work. She teaches in the clinical and advanced general methods areas, the master's and doctoral programs, and has served for 15 years as the associate director of the social intervention group at the school, where she's been a faculty affiliate since 2014. Dr. Witte's research is broadly targeted to the evolution of more efficient and effective methods for evidence-based program implementation in local and global communities, with a particular focus on women's sexual and reproductive health, including HIV, STI prevention, and the many co-occurring related issues women experience. Dr. Witte has also worked with communities of women engaged in sex work, collaborating with colleagues in the United States and abroad. She currently serves as a faculty co-director of the School of Social Work's newest center, the Action Lab for Social Justice. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. And I want to, since at Social Work, we take a person-centered approach to all that we do, I want to start off by asking our panelists, how are you doing? And can you offer some personal reflections of the election season, our current results? We have a president-elect, but as we all know, there's those who are disputing the election results. So I'm wondering, just from a personal standpoint, how you're feeling. And I'll start with you, Dr. Fuchs.
Oh, I'm taking a deep breath now. Happy to be on this panel with people who take a people-centered approach. That is not the case in most of the policy world, unfortunately, that I deal with. I'm sort of nervous and excited at the same time. I understand that we have a president who, continues to try and undermine our democratic institutions and tries to ignore the reality that's in front of him in the outcome of this election. I hope I have an opportunity later to tell you some of the facts, which I think will make you feel better. But I just have in my mind Saturday. I live near Columbia. People were hanging out the windows, yelling and screaming. There was literally dancing in the streets on 111th Street. A crowd of 200 people gathered in excitement, and cars were honking, including Postal Service workers and FDNY and the NYPD, and even the ambulances still coming up and down the streets with dealing with COVID patients primarily. I am optimistic. I'm optimistic by nature. I remain optimistic at the moment. Our democratic institutions are prevailing, and I believe will continue to prevail.
Dr. Fuchs. Dr. Hardy, you're based in DC, and I'm curious in what you're seeing there and how you're feeling about the reactions to the election.
So first of all, I'm happy to be here, grateful to be here. And, Carmen, I think to your first question, on an individual level, I think there's this sense of absorbing a lot of the feelings that the array of neighbors, family members, students, and even faculty are kind of projecting. And so, in my role, I've found that it's actually been sort of a challenge to kind of step back because, I'm sort of picking up everything they're feeling, their angst, in addition to my own. With that said, as sort of looking at the policy landscape, looking at kind of the reaction in, Montgomery County, right on the District of Columbia line, likewise, the reaction in this community that is overwhelmingly blue was overwhelmingly positive. There were makeshift parades, not the best parades by college band standards, but a lot of good energy there, banging on pots and stuff like that. So, I think I'm hopeful overall. And yet, I think that there's some sense of being circumspect. It kind of reminds me of, if you're in a canoe, if I'm thinking about my old summer camp days, and, if you had a hole in the canoe, your first job was to try to plug the hole. And then you might try to think about getting to shore, where metaphorical shore might be some of the bigger changes that I think many folks in the social welfare policy and social work world would want to see. So I think that we've kind of potentially solved that first part, and that gives me a sense of relief. That's kind of how I felt. So I could say more on it, but I'll stop there.
We'll definitely want to hear more. Dr. Witte.
Thanks, Karma. Thanks, Bradley and Esther. So I guess I want to echo the jubilance of my colleagues, that moment on Saturday when folks were dancing and cheering in the streets. Seeing Kamala Harris address the country was just breathtaking. I feel the relief. And at the same time, because we're at social work, to be person-centered, I guess I want to be quite specific to my own positionality. I feel very concerned and humbled about staying vigilant about people like me, because I think we're a bellwether of what's to come, and I want to unpack that for a minute. So where I stand, a white academic liberal, particularly in social work, I haven't had to suffer the same levels of psychological distress. I'm employed. I have the protection of an Ivy League institution. I'm not going to lose my access to contraception or healthcare, or be deported, or be discriminated against because of either the color of my skin or many of my identities. I live in the suburbs. I have easy access during COVID to be able to survive. And so I think that I hope what our conversation starts to tackle is what I know a recent writer talked about, being very careful not to fall back into the comfort of myth of what it might mean to have won. And so quite personally, I'm aware that where I stand and the relief I feel is mine, and it's very different than that reflected of many of those that we serve and in the communities that we seek to support.
Thank you, Susan. Esther, I wonder if you can help frame our conversation around sort of where we are now with our democracy, right? Particularly if we think about in relation to 2016. So if you could give us a sense of where we are.
I'd like to do that. And, it's interesting what everybody said. I'm not worried about people falling back into comfort. I'm worried about disaffection and alienation and the progress being too slow, as Bradley was pointing out. You know, the hole in the boat is plugged for the moment, but we do have an enormous challenge ahead. And I'm much more worried that people will pull back from this enormous engagement that we've just experienced. So let me tell you about what happened and put it in a little perspective. And I think that there is reason actually to be optimistic in terms of the direction our country is going, despite the numbers of people that voted for Donald Trump, which seems to be the headline of most news reports. So first, I want to say this emphatically and clearly. The first fact is Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump. And, you know, somebody said to me, take your win. Take your win. It's really important to understand that in the American politics, that's the nature of the win. And, you know, historically, elections are close in this country. The idea of a divided country is not exactly new to the 2020 election. So we have divisions, and we've had it for quite a long time. The positive piece for me is that the structure of our democracy requires coalitions. You cannot win with just your own small group. And to talk about the direction that we're moving in terms of both the demographics and the activists, that is moving in the direction of the coalition that the Democratic Party put together in this election. So some quick just facts on the ground that, you know, people get very frustrated around the Electoral College. I too am very frustrated around the Electoral. It is anti-democratic, small d. It was put into place intentionally so that we would not have a direct election of the president. And for the moment, it is going to be very difficult to change that aspect of our democracy, because the states which benefit from this system, the smaller rural states, have no interest in changing it. That should not surprise anybody. However, their influence in the process is actually diminishing to a certain extent. So Biden has a commanding lead in the Electoral College right now. As we speak, 279 electoral votes, doesn't include Georgia and Arizona, which are expected to go to Biden. There is no path for victory for President Trump. I'm willing to say that unequivocally, emphatically, despite his protestations, despite the possibility of his court cases, which he will bring, but the ability for these elections to flip in these individual states now, given Biden's margin of victory, is near zero for the most part. So the second fact is Biden won the popular vote, and he won it with a greater percentage than Hillary Clinton did, okay? So this is an important thing to put down. And we had extraordinary turnout in this election, and I'll get to that very quickly. So right now, Biden has 50.7% of the popular vote and Trump 47.6%. This is over 76.2 million voters for Biden and 71.5 million voters for Trump. So yes, we are a divided country. Yes, there's way too many people that continue to vote for Trump, and it's incumbent on us to understand who they are and why they did that. There's a whole cottage industry about the Trump voters who also voted for Barack Obama. So this is fluid in large parts of the electorate. I'm not saying in all parts, obviously, but in large parts. And bear in mind, again, what happened in 2016. Hillary Clinton actually did beat Donald Trump in the popular vote. So that's also important for us to keep in mind in terms of the direction, and the victory for Biden is greater than Hillary's was. And if you consider the margins in the swing states, this is really very important, and I won't get into the weeds here. But the three swing states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Okay, everybody ready for this? In 2016, Trump won Michigan by 13,000 votes. Wisconsin, 27,200. Pennsylvania, 68,200. Okay, this is not a lot of votes, folks. And of course, what happened now is when we consider these margins, they were close then, they continue to be close now, and that's the consequence of the structure of our political process and the Electoral College, that those states have this disproportionate influence on the outcome. And now you can see the swing went the other way, and Trump was able to win in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and actually take a couple of other states along with him that weren't considered to be states where Democrats could contest. So when we look at Georgia, for example, and Arizona, these will be two important wins for the Democratic Party and for the progressive moderate coalition that Biden put together. And I'll stop with that, and then we can come back with the issues that drove candidates in this election, because I think that's equally as important for us to understand, and very different than what people might be thinking, and some of the identity politics that played out. Where were people in this race and who actually turned out, and what were some of those surprises in terms of, you know, the Hispanic vote, the Black vote, the white evangelical vote, the Jewish vote. So I'll stop at that just to give people context. To me, the most important takeaway is the increased engagement, the increased participation. My view is we want everybody to participate, and this outcome for this election in that regard is something that's very positive.
Thank you, Esther. Yeah, and I think speaking of engagement, all eyes are on Georgia, right, to see what this will mean come January, the outcome of the Senate elections there, and what that would mean for, I think, the Biden-Harris administration's ability to pass through various legislation. And I'm wondering, Dr. Hardy, if you want to share thoughts on, sort of from an economic standpoint, you know, Biden is inheriting quite a challenge. Even though we see the stock market going up, we still see the impacts of COVID-19. This election highlighted again the economic disparities across communities, particularly between communities of color and white communities. And I would love to hear your thoughts on sort of the challenges that the Biden-Harris administration faces and how they could work with this current Congress to push some of their initiatives.
Sure. No, I really appreciate that question. And in a sense, to try to get at that, I want to sort of pick up a little bit of where Esther kind of left off, and then I'll go into the economy question. And I just think it's really useful to think about this notion that, you know, we've sort of witnessed in political terms a pretty strong win, right? Like, and, you know, this idea that this is sort of what it looks like, but to reproduce this Midwestern blue wall and to then put a state like Georgia in play, it's worth reflecting that, you know, we've always had these sort of factions. Oh, by the way, I'm just dropping things in my home office here. Don't mind me, everything's fine. But we've always had these factions, right? And we've had these factions that consist of labor. We've had, you know, subsets of you know, white voters across states. We've had larger subsets of civil rights groups and Black religious groups and Black voters, for example, that have come together to create these factions, right? And I think what's really valuable to kind of witness is that, you know, when you take a look at groups like Fair Fight, you know, led by Stacey Abrams, for example, well, you know, I view it as kind of a re-energizing of these factions that have long existed. You know, in my 40th year on Earth, one of the fascinating things that's occurring is that I'm seeing reboots of movies that I enjoyed as a child, right? And so I'm saying, well, they did that back when I was 12, right? Well, you know, the point is that, well, some of these themes repeat themselves, but you have to reintroduce a new group of voters, new constituencies to the ideas. And so with that said, to Karma's question, well, what are the economic policy opportunities? Among other things, look, I think that there is, and I'm not sure whether to call it a New Deal moment or a Great Society 2 moment for Biden-Harris, but I think that, the initiative, the salience of the problem is laid bare in some similar ways contextually, thinking about the past, that you have sort of a historic economic crisis that's hit the country. And so I think there's an opportunity to consider kind of a broad set of reforms, and you could think about the whole gamut of policies that many of us have been talking about for years, paid family leave, childcare support and subsidies, higher minimum wages on a national level, thinking about bold reforms to reduce, child poverty, state and local infrastructure aid. And so, I don't have a crystal ball, but I do think there's this opportunity to think about broader economic relief that's kind of motivated by COVID, but that could actually lock in some bigger structural reforms. And my reading of the sorts of economists who are advising this this team is that I think there's going to be a push in that direction. And I guess, and I could say more on that, not to pour cold water on this, but you do have what very well could be a Republican-controlled Senate. And, if you're looking to these sorts of bolder reforms, my concern is that you're all of a sudden going to see, sort of newfound concerns and commitments to deficit reduction, right? These commitments, oftentimes from the right, they kind of pop up at specific times. And, Obama, Biden faced this years prior. And so I think that there's good arguments to beat that back. But I do think there's going to be the clear motivation and initiative to push forward. I think one concern that I have is that, we can talk about the composition of the Democratic, base, whatever that is. And I do think that because the party has lurched, the party opposite the Democrats has lurched so far to the right, that you do have participants in the Democratic Party who might have been Republicans in like 1970. And I don't say that as a necessarily negative thing, but it is this sort of this challenge to think about not just the fissures between parties, but potential disagreements within party. Again, I want to allow for time for all of us, though, so I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Hardy. And Dr. Witte, did you want to add thoughts as well around sort of your reflections on the political divisions we're seeing and the possible economic opportunities we see?
Sure. I would like to go back and just clarify to Esther that I guess I screwed up the quote. It wasn't comfort. It was the comfort of myth, the comfort of the belief that things are better now, because and it was Jamal Bowie who mentioned that the things that Trump and the Republican Party at an extreme have represented for some in our country in the last 4 years were done many, many times before for centuries. And it is true that in many of our urban centers that are led by Democrats, we haven't been able to be as successful in responding to the needs of many groups. So I guess I want to also echo that the highest number of voter turnout is fantastic for democracy, and I hope we continue that. I guess I want to point to echoing what Dr. Hardy said. It's my 56th year on Earth. I was born the year that Fannie Lou Hamer gave her famous speech as a leader of the Democratic Freedom Party before the Credentials Committee of the Democratic National Convention, saying she's sick and tired of being sick and tired. And we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the right to vote for women, but really it's only since the late 1960s that Black women in this country had the right to vote. And so it has never been true that bipartisanship has necessarily served or been right for many who have continued to suffer. And so I guess I think this is the next 4 years have to do with the degree to which we are able to look at what does bipartisanship or compromise mean if it's at the expense of the needs of Black women in our country, Black families, other families of color, other historically marginalized groups. And so I would just sort of throw that in for consideration.
I really appreciate your comments, Dr. Witte, especially just thinking about Joe Biden's constantly resonating with the theme that this was a fight for the soul of our nation, right? And a soul for bringing communities of color together, for amplifying the voices of our Native American communities. And to your point about around voter mobilization, and I'd love to hear more from you, Dr. Fuchs, around this, of seeing such strong and significant increases, both not just in Georgia, but I think across Black voters in general, but also our Native American voters really, really coming out and to ensure that their voices were heard. I wonder if you can speak more about just voter turnout.
Yeah, so we're actually just on track to have the highest voter turnout, I guess they're saying, since 1900, which would be for a presidential election, which would be pretty extraordinary. There's a couple of points that people made that I think are really interesting, and I'd like to comment on them as it relates to voter turnout and the kinds of coalitions that will be necessary to create the progressive policy agenda that Bradley talked about, because that is the agenda that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris ran on. So the first point is it is the structural problem. One has to recognize that the Senate is critical in any kind of legislation. And so if we end up having a Republican-controlled Senate, I don't believe that Joe Biden's capacity to reach over the aisle is going to be particularly effective with this Senate. I agree with Susan, actually, that the compromises that are made are really important. And one of the reasons I personally did not initially support Joe Biden is because I felt he compromised at the expense of our low-income populations, our high-risk populations, our disenfranchised populations. Yes, he compromised, but I don't think the outcomes of those compromises were particularly good for cities or for anybody else that cares about progressive politics. Having said that, in the context of this election, he won, and he appointed as his vice president Kamala Harris. She can potentially have a very outsized role here in framing the legislative agenda and the kinds of policies that this administration tries to move forward. She was in the Senate. I actually think these things are very important, these kinds of experiences. These are small numbers of people we're dealing with here, right? So, while mass mobilization is very important, protests are, we just saw how important protests are. The nuts and bolts of the legislative process require those personal relationships and being able to make that case. And so I think that because of the nature of the crises we're all going through now, from COVID to the economic crisis, for the Republican Party to remain relevant in the next 10 years, they've got to help the Democratic leadership get something done around, around a relief package and around some real serious changes in what Bradley was talking about, an infrastructure package and relief for working America also. So I think that the stars are lined up now for movement, and it's not just because of the vote. I want to emphasize that. It's because of other forms of political engagement that have been happening, which is the protest. This has been a very important catalyst for change in this country. To me, I'm always struggling with my students about, like, what do you do with protest if you don't link it to the vote? So something really exciting happened in this election, a lot of protest was linked to the vote. And I just want to put another one piece of data on the table here, which I think most people are probably not aware of. Normally in presidential politics, the most important issue that motivates people is the economy, right? And that is, and it's the subjective perception of the economy, not just like how is the economy really doing, it's how it's doing for me, right? So in the exit poll, when they asked people what were the most important issue in your vote, 35% continued to say the economy. But this is really amazing. 20%, the second highest, said racial inequity. That doesn't even appear in earlier elections as an issue. People have opinions, but it doesn't motivate their vote. That's a whole different thing, as everybody knows, right? And then 17% said the COVID pandemic. So, and another 11% said healthcare and policy. Now, bear in mind that, 91% of those who voted for Biden said cited racial inequity as their first issue, or 91% of the people, rather, 91% of the people who cited racial inequity as their first issue voted for Biden. So he's got a base that cares in his coalition that cares about racial inequity. And then the second one is the COVID pandemic folks. And so this is very important. His base also said that they thought containing the virus has to be attended to first, even if it hurts the economy. So so we're getting some direction from the popular vote here about what they're expecting from the Democratic Party. And that's without going into the strict sort of identity aspects, of who voted on, from which ethnic and racial and religious group. So I feel like that should inform the baseline going into the legislative negotiations right now.
Hey, Carmen, can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
Okay, well, I was just going to say very, very briefly that, I even think there's a possibility that, great reporting from Jeff Bennett over at MSNBC, the White House Correspondents Group, kind of just reminding folks that even as this political win is coming in, it is depressed by a slowed USPS, right? You also have more complexity. I mean, we've never voted as a society en masse like this before. You had folks like Obama going on video, walking folks through the process. So, I think there is a world in which, the actual support is what it is, or even more so. I mean, if you add to that just kind of the unique information environment, and look, there's other people who work on this and are experts in it, but I read them, and they're sort of saying, look, you have more news sources than ever. You have these disinformation campaigns. You can have the distortion of protest movements and conflate it with looting and rioting, right? So that was occurring. So, I don't know the numbers on this, but, you might have peeled off votes by those sorts of arguments from the right that, in my view, weren't at all accurate. But, the point is that they're probably, you have these slices of voters who are, to, Esther's point, I think, flexible and amenable to, stronger policy interventions. And, I think this is going to get into this notion, within the Democratic Party about what the design is. So are we talking about kind of universal policies that have disproportionate impacts on, say, Black Americans? Are they more targeted policies? That's going to be an interesting question. But I do know from the data that, many Americans are feeling high levels of economic uncertainty and insecurity. Now that's hitting Black communities generally the worst. Hispanic communities are being hit as well pretty badly. And many white Americans are feeling the pain also. Now there's an inequity in how that's penetrating on average. But I think that, there is this potential space. I do remain circumspect that, my reading of how the Republican Party has sort of operated is that they kind of respond rather to strength. So this idea that there might be abilities to sort of work across the aisle, but it might have to come from a position of strength.
Yeah, Susan.
Can I jump in? So I just want to dovetail on what Dr. Hardy was saying. I think I want to hold some of that optimism, but I do think that if we're talking about expanding a voter base, we have, it actually reflects on something, Dr. Fuchs, that you said a little bit earlier about feeling like the Republican Party has to collaborate and in order to stay relevant. I think there's an equal argument to be made for the fact that if as Democrats we don't do a lot of really deep anti-racist work with the white electorate, that we can't keep losing white electorate to Republican politics unless, because there's not enough people of color and youth to make up for that, right? And Ocasio-Cortez addressed that a couple weeks ago. And also I think I hear from our students a great concern about many of the more progressive policies that we're suggesting are going to be adopted within a democratic political policy format. But in fact, I think that for the first time in a long time, what we're seeing is a youth electorate who's becoming radicalized pretty much again before our eyes because of the climate crisis on top of the COVID pandemic, on top of Black Lives Matter. And that is a very powerful and very important. And so as our students are expressing this concern and disenfranchisement and alienation from what is the Democratic Party, there's a lot of soul searching, I guess. I'm not hearing as much about where we can push around trying to encourage more inclusion and addressing some of those schisms. And I know we'll talk later about some of the major social divisions caused by social media that bring us to that place.
Could I jump in here for a minute, Karma, with just to add some more data to the conversation and about, the schisms and who voted for whom in this and the issue of what happened to the moderate Republicans and are there any more? So one of the things that one of my colleagues in political science pointed out to me is that as Republicans became disenchanted with Trump, they did not stay in the party. So the new data on party ID doesn't reflect a whole lot of Republicans that might have been there previously. They did not become Democrats, they became independents. And so this is really interesting. The electorate in this election broke down to 37% Democrat, 35% Republican, and 28% independent, which is a large number in American politics. And, not surprisingly, the Democrats primarily voted for, Biden, and the Republicans primarily voted for Trump. But the independents split for the Democratic Party 54-40. 54 in favor of Trump and 40 in favor, 54 in favor of Biden and 40 in favor of Trump. So in the context of this, this very close split now in the electorate among these three identities, which are actually very important, people are voting party now, way more. I mean, that's the other thing that's been fascinating to me as we think about how this will impact our ability to pass legislation and change the direction of policy. The parties are kind of digging in. And when I used to teach parties and elections, students would get crazy because it was like, oh, it's just Tweedledum, Tweedledee, the parties make no difference. Well, this is, in my view, what we would call a critical election, when you can actually see very clear differences between the two parties. And the one ray of optimism here is that the direction that if the Republicans continue to move the party in the direction of the radical right Trump voters, they can't expand sufficiently to create a majority coalition. They can win the presidency every so often because of the nature of the Electoral College. But as the demographics keep moving, that coalition becomes more and more impossible. And the Republicans themselves recognized this when they went after the Hispanic vote. And I would say, last point, the most troubling thing for the Democratic Party to me was not the white vote in this election, which, by the way, the breakdown, the very simple breakdown that people need to remember is that the electorate broke down still 65% white, okay? That's a higher than the proportion in the population, 12% Black, 13% Hispanic Latino, 3% Asian. And then the rest is other. So it is still the electorate, as opposed to the population, is still largely white, which goes to Susan's point about why it's important to continue engaging that population and educating people to what is really going on out there in terms of their own policy interests. And that to me has been one of the most troubling aspects of the Trump coalition. Somebody, I thought, said it well, and I'll stop with that Trump managed to collect the grievance voters. And by the way, that grievance group included 36% of Hispanic men and 18% of Black men and 58% of white men. So there's a huge gender gap going on right now. And the gender gap is even larger. It's largest in the Latino population right now. And so the work that has to be done here is not just among white voters. That's not just Cubans in Florida, folks. That also was Mexicans in the south of Texas. So I'll stop at that.
So how do we crack through that, right? We've talked a lot about the need for collaboration. We talked a lot about the needs for coalition building. And what's clear from all of your comments is that race is a dynamic that's cross-cutting all of these issues, whether it's economic inequality, disproportionate impact of COVID-19. And so when we're talking about progressive policies and how to benefit those communities that have been historically marginalized and continue to be disenfranchised, right? So how do we crack through that to ensure that those policies will make it, especially as we look at the possibility of having a Republican-controlled Senate again. And as you said, Esther, where the Republicans are digging in, right, and really voting along party lines. So how do we get that bipartisan relationship so that we can move some of these policies forward so they're helping everyone who's being economically impacted, not just across sort of racial lines, but also particularly helping those disadvantaged groups? And I'll leave it open to anyone.
I'll say one thing quickly, which is not about the coalition process or anything like that. This is why I think the rules of the game are always important to know. I think Biden is going to have to start with a lot of executive orders, because if the and by the way, that's what Trump did in a way that was unimaginable to almost everybody that I know. And he created very significant changes by digging deep into the bureaucracy and remolding, agencies that we thought, will be protected by the institutions themselves, and we weren't. And so I believe that's the first thing as they negotiate with the Senate, whatever it looks like, a stimulus package will be passed, because that's in the interest of the Republican Party. And that's hardball that has to be played there. And I think the extent to which our, young people continue to organize, Blacks and whites come together on the streets in those coalitions, I think the street activity is visible and is playing a role in legislative politics in a way that only happens, once every 30, 40 years, maybe at that. I think that has to happen on one side, and that Biden has to start plowing through with executive orders. He said today already, you know, dreamers are going to be protected. He's got to do it all down the line wherever he can. And yeah, let them worry about going to the courts now to overturn some of these executive orders. You can do a lot, it turns out, through executive orders that we didn't realize you could.
No, I mean, I think that there is an opportunity here. Look, you know, Democrats are going to have to look at these exit polls. And I think that, look, some of these numbers are going to shift around a little bit as we sort of hone in on the true estimates of sort of who voted what. With that said, we know that, you know, overwhelming shares of both Black men and women voted Biden. Now, you know, my own view, and again, there's political scientists who think about this even more deeply, but, you know, unfortunately, I do think that for some subset of male voters, and including some Black male voters, that some of the misogyny translates, right? That's just what it is, and that's unfortunate. But you will get some subset of male voters who will find some of those messages and themes appealing. Again, you know, I don't want to paint with too wide of a brush here. With that said, though, it's easy to kind of pay a lot of, you know, put too much weight on, you know, a few percentage point changes. And I'm not saying that we're doing that here. My main point is to say, you've got, you know, some estimates showing 86% of Black men voted Biden, 93% of Black women voted. Likewise, majorities of Hispanic men and women voted Biden. So sort of leaving that aside, I do think that, yeah, you know, in the electoral context, there's going to be sort of an expectation of what policies and reforms and conversations emerge from this victory that really did consist of this broad coalition, and including, importantly, you know, racial and ethnic minority groups. And so, you know, I think that, look, this is cautious optimism. I'm actually kind of a circumspect person, so I'm trying to work on being more positive, right? So, you know, you're seeing now policy think tanks engaging openly in discussions about reform proposals that I don't think would have been taken seriously by these groups, which can be slow moving, to be blunt, even a decade or 15 years ago. So discussions about what a serious reparations proposal would look like. This has been done in other Western countries. Like, there is a precedent for this. What would that look like? How might a UBI type proposal be packaged as a child allowance? What are the vehicles for implementing that? Could you do it through kind of the apparatus of the Social Security system? You know, so these conversations are occurring, and my suspicion is that the advocacy community, the voters, are going to be looking to see if those conversations persist. And, you know, I do think that, again, the political communication experts are going to have to get involved here in terms of learning how to talk about these things in ways that don't make the entire faction sort of eat away at itself. You can have policies that help somebody else and don't harm me, right? So I teach this, it's called sort of Pareto equilibrium, right? And so, you know, that can exist. And in a society where you want to have safe neighborhoods, safe communities, thriving businesses, I mean, you know, you want all of your neighbors to be doing well. So there's a moral reason for it, but there's an economic reason for it as well. And so again, I don't mean to forecast how I think that conversation is going to go, but I certainly think it's going to happen, right? And because you do have these groups that were successfully mobilized, right?
Yeah, I just want to add a little bit onto that before we move to open it up to the larger audience for questions, but to bring from the political and economic context back to sort of the social, that I I don't know the stats on whether or not this has ever been true before. I'm going to guess it hasn't been, but the social divisions in our country are so extreme that we're talking at, I'm going to suggest maybe we all know family members or friends who have family members who voted across partisan lines that have created divisions and difficulties, right? So we know that as of January in Trump's third year of office, that Republicans were 89% in support, Democrats were only 7% in support. And so that's a huge divide. And then if we translate that to individual families, so we know that 89% of Trump and Biden voters as recently as September or supporters said that they don't know anyone else in their social circle that they communicate with who votes for the other side. Our students speak to the divisions within their own family about being unable to communicate and becoming alienated from family members. So we as social workers and human service workers need to promote those conversations that I suspect could support the political communications, because we need to find ways for families to be able to heal, right? This is on top of, what we didn't cover yet, which is alcohol use is up 14% in men, 17% in women. Opioid overdoses are up 18% across the country, and worse in rural areas than in urban areas. That suicide rates are up 10.7% from 4% in 2018. And we didn't go through the litany of data that we know from the psychological aspects of both COVID and the election have heightened the sense of anxiety and depression across our country. And that, with the familial discord as it disenfranchises individuals and families, and we lose some of that community cohesion, feels very important, particularly on an individual and community level through social work and others of us, to strengthen in order to support the organizing for the political.
And Susan, I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that. And do you foresee that we'll see a shift in the other direction? Like, as we've seen the rise in substance use, in domestic violence, and intimate partner violence, now that we have we have a decision, or we have a president-elect, and now that we're starting to look at his agenda items, do you think that we'll see that shift where there'll be a decrease in those numbers, or do you think they'll hold for a while?
Yeah. I think a lot of this was driven initially by a lot of the psychological impact that I'm talking about from the data suggests that COVID-19 and the sheltering in place have heightened much of the issues related to domestic violence, for example, and inaccessibility to be able to report or to be able to create distance or leave abusive relationships. And so I think the election was sort of on top of that, adding to the anxiety and the depression related to the unknown. I think the uncertainty of both, there's an advantage to the fact that now we have a solid outcome. So there is certainty, and the building back work begins to bridging those conversations amongst family members to strengthen. I don't necessarily think that we're going to see additional increases that are associated with a Biden win and a Trump loss, or those divisions. We certainly could see potentially more community violence, depending on how the transfer of power plays out. But I guess that feels like it largely remains to be seen.
So as we've been talking about coalition building and crossing party lines, you have a question for our audience around how do we get white people to talk about race when they don't want to talk about it, particularly with respect to our economic policies, and to your point, Dr. Hardy, about, like, we can pass policies that benefit others but don't harm me. So how do we get them to embrace that perspective?
Well, briefly, and one of the hardest things to do as a new professor sometimes, and I'm not new anymore, is to admit when you don't really know, right? And so when I'm advising the junior faculty, I'm saying, well, you don't know everything. And so that's a great question. And I'm going to admit that I'll defer some of this to the other panelists, and I'm not sure completely, but I would just offer up this. And I think you'll see it's related. I think Trump was, as Andre Perry over at Brookings said, he was sort of a reflection, and I would expand upon that. a reflection of policy positions and attitudes that aren't necessarily new, right? And so, in fact, and I believe Esther or Susan made this point, maybe both, that, you know, Biden kind of ran on character and integrity at various points. It wasn't even necessarily about policy positions. It's worthwhile considering how this would have played out with a more palatable candidate on, say, the Republican side, who was initiating the same policies, but without the rhetoric, and who maybe presented it, I guess, in a more affable manner. And so, you know, my point is that as far as being able to communicate, I think the good news is that, you know, if you look at some exit poll data, you know, you've got the independents, you have folks on the Republican side who I think are very interested in social and economic mobility topics, for example. And that's a topical area where I do my work. I think those folks are there. I think they can be talked to. I think there's data suggesting that many voters didn't receive any contacts from the Democratic Party, for example, or sort of progressive organizations. So there's still people you can touch. I think this narrative of red and blue states, you know, I did my grad work at Kentucky, and it's a fascinating thing. There's all these mountain liberals, and, you know, you consistently get 40 and 45% of the electorate in Kentucky voting blue, voting progressive. And sometimes it's as if they just don't exist. And so it's like, no, you know, and that's an overwhelmingly white state. And so it's like, no, these people are here, they exist. Many of them are largely on board. If you look nationally, you know, much has been made of a majority of white women voting Trump, but, you know, it was a slim majority, you know, so you've got just under half voting Biden. So, and again, within those Trump voters, I still think that you can make those contacts. You can make the push. And again, there's political analysts who think really hard about this, harder than I do. But, you know, it's an interesting thing. Things aren't always what it seems. Back in the early 80s, you know, it's fascinating. There's this story that still persists, that Jesse Jackson had a whole Appalachia tour where he talked about poverty. And it turns out that he's surprisingly popular in Eastern Kentucky. And, you know, I found that surprising. So, you know, I think that there are these nonlinearities that may be exploitable. And I do think that that conversation has to occur. At the same time, you know, I am circumspect about how effective that may be. And sometimes you just got to whip up the votes, right? You know, and it, you know, you just have to have some political clout and power.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I love everything that Bradley said, and I would just add a couple of points. And it really, part of it goes back to this question of, do we expect our leaders to sometimes lead public opinion or just be completely responsive to it? And, you know, we know when Johnson passed much of the Great Society legislation, he did not have the support of the majority of the American people. And then when we actually look at the polls now, the middle has moved. It moved to a more liberal/progressive place. I mean, you know, it's hard for us to kind of realize that in the context of the Trump, the Trump victory in the last election. But in fact, I think this is a time, while I think the conversation has to continue and that we need to engage everyone and that we need to embark on this enormous education campaign, frankly, whether it's sort of like the Peace and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, where you do this. I've talked to some of my friends, people I know who have been involved in those kinds of things. And I think the one thing that the George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement has made clear, the Confederate monuments has made clear to the white liberals who were sort of happy in the place that Susan described earlier, is that we needed to not be so happy in that place, and that that has been wrong for a very long time, and that hasn't been part of a national conversation. So I think that needs to go on. And then, but at the same time, I want to, I would go back to Bradley's points, which is we need some movement in Washington that, frankly, just pushes through some of these changes that have to be made. And they may be things that are not completely supported yet out there by the majority of Americans. The political process is structured that way, in effect. And the right has used it to its advantage recently. And now it's time for the moderates and progressives and left, whatever you want to call it, to also use this aspect of the system to its advantage, which is start pushing through these policy changes that do make sense for the majority of the American people, some of whom don't actually know that, but will benefit from it. Who benefited from, from Roosevelt's programs first, were people who didn't even support it to begin with. The same thing with Lyndon Johnson. And by the way, I think we need a new Voting Rights Act in a hurry. That's the other thing I really want to see this president do. And I actually think that's doable. I may be Pollyanna a little bit, but
by executive order.
You can't do it but you can start it. Yeah. I always, in politics, people have described me as a pragmatic utopian. So I believe you have to have these goals, but at the same time, you have to play the political game to get it done. And it's not always going to reflect the public and public opinion. And that, that's a hard one in a way. We'll get there. I mean, why you don't see the movement in the Republican Party is because those people left and they became independents, and Biden won significantly the independent vote. And that's really important. That's where those Lincoln Republicans basically went. And they need to be part of the majority coalition moving forward for our nation.
And I know we'll probably want to move on to another question, but I guess I want to just add, in addition to what's been said already, and there's been some excellent resources posted in the chat. The People's Institute out of New Orleans for Survival and Beyond is an excellent place for white people to do work around undoing racism. The initiatives that some universities across the country have begun, and if it starts with teaching and learning and trying to, I won't use the term decolonize, but I'll use the term to infuse power, race, oppression, and privilege lenses through the curriculum and the pedagogy that we're using. I think there has to be a higher level of accountability to follow through with that, not only in schools of social work, but I think at Columbia we are seeing seed funding and initiatives being undertaken and trying to hold it accountable, ask for reports, follow through, see how we're doing, find some outcome data that we might actually look at. And these are all new areas of whiteness studies, for example, that are being initiated by some of our own doctoral students and faculty to be able to understand how to create that shift and truly undo racism.
Thanks, Susan. I was wondering if you could continue just talking about the role of social workers, not just in undoing racism, but if we're thinking about these political shifts in the country, so how do social workers get involved in those advocacy efforts to dispel the misinformation campaigns, dispel some of the propaganda, and to really sort of highlight the core issues that do cross-cut our identities and impact just large swaths of the government, the United States?
Sure. So the Action Lab for Social Justice at Columbia has been one of the newer organizations at the School of Social Work promoting invitations for volunteers, for anyone in the community to become more involved through action initiatives. These are popping up all over the country. Our Social Work Votes initiative did a tremendous amount of voter registration and education. I think the issue of social media is a huge behemoth. You should do one post-election talk on itself, right? So we're finally coming to terms with what it means to have a platform that's global for misinformation and for divisive rhetoric, and how difficult it is to control that. So as social workers, we can be educators, we can provide support for thinking through critiquing and the quality of information that our students and that our community members are gleaning from social media. And I would suggest getting involved through community-based organizations that you're working with, who you support, who support your agenda, donations, and other ways that we've responded to many of the issues pre-election, to continue to do those things and to continue to, as Esther said earlier, we do need to focus on Georgia right now and the possibility that the Senate could still be swung. I know that's there's a slim margin of likelihood that could happen, but nevertheless, it's a possibility. So if there are ways to help support continuous voter registration for those runoffs, that would be super important.
Thanks for highlighting the social media piece, Susan. I know one of the things we've seen pop up around social media is this idea of packing the courts. And that seemed to be a contentious discussion that's popping up. And one of our attendees is asking sort of what's the likelihood that we could see a structural change with regard to changing the makeup of the Supreme Court and expanding it. I'm wondering if Dr. Fuchs or Dr. Hardy have any thoughts on that.
I'll just say quickly on this, everything's on the table. And it's sort of like when we vote for term limits, my initial inclination about term limits was it's anti-democratic, small d, because, if people want to reelect somebody 20 times, they should have the right to do it in our democracy. But my view is, when the system is structurally broken, then you have to take measures that put it back in balance. So just like in New York, for example, and other parts of the country, incumbents would win 99.9% of the time. And that to me was the rationale for term limits, because it wasn't competitive elections. Something was broken. If it comes to that, if we see that the courts operate, the Supreme Court operates in a partisan manner, then that to me would be grounds for increasing the number of Supreme Court justices. It has to be rebalanced when it's broken.
Yeah, I mean, what Esther said, I mean, basically, and I mean, I guess the only piece that I would maybe kind of anchor on or add on would just be that, well, there's lots of instances where we've seen what appeared to be rules turn out to really be norms, or we've seen rules that then get adjusted. And so, in any, and I'm speaking in very crass political terms, in any sort of political fight, well, then you've got to adapt to what is occurring. And so I think that this is sort of about adapting to what the reality is, right? And there were these norms surrounding when and how you would appoint justices, and that's shifted. And and there's others who might know the history better than I do, but my sense is that the number of Supreme Court justices has shifted throughout history. So it's not as if it was always just 8, 9 or whatever, right? So I think that there's the space there to make that change. Absolutely.
Do you think making a change like that will impact Democrats' ability to save or maintain the Affordable Care Act, which we know is currently being deliberated by the Supreme Court?
That's up now. So this court is going to hear that. And, I'm not taking bets on that. Not taking bets on that.
This is interesting, though. There's a world in which, a policy and sort of judicial set of actions that result in the removal of insurance for large swaths of Americans then creates kind of the political space to do something big and bold. And again, you know, I'm pretending I have a crystal ball that I really don't own. But you know, that, yeah, to Esther's point, I mean, right, you know, that's there in front of us, and I'm very nervous. I mean, you know.
Right. I mean, you know, if they're true to what they say about precedent, it should remain. Now we'll see how actually politicized the court has become in that sense.
So one of our attendees, actually it's been seconded, is curious about how the Democratic Party can stay relevant. There were some comments before about what the Republicans need to do to stay relevant. So what do Democrats, particularly now, you know, leading up to the Georgia runoffs and then looking forward to the next 4 years in our Biden-Harris administration?
Could we get some clarification on that? Like, what does relevant mean and relevant to whom?
Yeah, I think that's the big question.
Are they talking about young people in particular? Is that the deal here? Or or Blacks or Hispanics?
I think the question came through when we were talking about mobilizing young voters, but that wasn't specifically mentioned. I think it's more around Democratic Party identity, and we've seen that shift. And even with Black voters who voted for Biden sort of feeling as though the Democratic Party is no longer or hasn't sort of lived up to the promises that were made to.
I'll take that because I'm sure my answer will be fairly unsatisfactory to the person who asked the question, which is that they don't have to stay relevant. The political party structure in this country, if you notice, we still have 2 political parties. It's very hard to mount a third party challenge. And even historically, when we've mounted a third party challenge, one of the 2 major parties disappears. So my understanding of how this process works is relevant is like not even in the lexicon. It's really, how do we construct a majority coalition to win, period? And that, you know, why did Republicans kind of just take all of their principles and shed them to support Donald Trump? I hate to say it, is because they viewed him as somebody who could win and help them win. Ultimately with that. It doesn't mean there are no principles and there are no policies. Of course there are, and you know, but fundamentally, it's about the winning coalition. And that's why we all need to speak up. That's why we need to be part of what moves each party in a particular direction and what kinds of policies they're going to promote. Because believe it or not, there's a kind of responsiveness there to the folks who can put together that majority. That won't surprise anybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think part of the challenge is, particularly from a social work perspective, is who gets to decide in order to put the resources together to win. It's such a small minority of people with wealth and power, and that's where a lot of the disenfranchisement comes from. So the degree to which any of the parties speak to, you know, back to your question, Karma, we can as social workers, I think, mobilize voters and then try to get behind policy changes like what Esther referred to, you know, voting rights legislation, but trying to take down Citizens United. I mean, the amount of money that was spent, the billions of dollars that were spent in elections in the last 4 years is obscene when we think about the social programs that could have been funded. I mean, there's that gigantic problem is yet another one to surmount, but people feel hugely disenfranchised, even as voters, in having a say to win. And so that's part of the problem.
I mean, you know, I would jump in and so, you know, I broadly agree. I do think that, you know, there's an opportunity. I'll talk about sort of 2 disparate items here. So looked at some Gallup data, and it's really interesting. If you think about something like, you know, across race, desire for police presence within your community. And so, you know, I'm looking right here, you know, it's something like 61% of Black Americans want police to spend about the same amount of time. That's similar to 67% for all groups. 20% of Black Americans want more police presence, about 19% want less. Now, the second question then being, how are you confident in a police encounter going? and Black Americans are far less confident that the police encounters will be safe. And so, boy, what a tense struggle that is. And my reading of the data is that, well, Black Americans want security. They want economic security. They want physical security in their neighborhoods. And economic development 101, whether you're talking about a country or a neighborhood, you need to have security to be able to have safe passage to go to and from your school, your grocery store, kids playing around the neighborhood, stuff like that. Well, so then I look at that data and I say, well, there is common ground on like police reform, police accountability. That it's not that you have this faction that's necessarily so divided on law enforcement per se, but I definitely know that the rhetoric is challenging, and the rhetoric definitely got distorted by folks on the right. So there's an opportunity to do something, and I guess getting to the relevance point, my suspicion is that you need to do something on this. You need to have a policy that's tangible that you can point to. I'll point to something else that's like the kind of thing that would put a lot of my students, well, let me be careful. Let me not malign my students. They're great students. Policy details like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program or food stamp, maximum guarantee. And it's like, well, we're talking about raising food assistance and SNAP benefits, and that matters to many progressives. But you can talk about that in a way where, the choices don't seem that stark, and, both parties are kind of flawed. And so I would argue like, well, no, I actually think that progressives feel strongly, I'm generalizing, because there are some folks on the right who feel this way also, but I do think in general, progressives and Democrats have made a point that they have tried to be more committed to boosting the social safety net. And so that has very real day-to-day implications for economic security. So is that point being made clearly? Perhaps. Can it be made more clearly? Probably.
Can I jump back and just say something about Susan's point and then follow up with what Bradley was saying, all of which is very compelling. I think it's important to bear in mind as we think about first the influence of money in politics, which is what Susan was referring to, which of course is real and and a given. But something really interesting is happening now, and it's very negative, but we can understand it in a positive way, which is voter suppression by the Republican Party. If votes didn't count, they wouldn't be going out of their way to try and prevent people from voting, right? So there is a strange confusion about the value of the vote, how voting influences policy, and then how we influence policy in the period between elections. So for me, when I think about, and this is why I'm obsessed with voting and started that website, Who's on the Ballot for New Yorkers, which is nonpartisan. And, I want whoever's a New Yorker, please, who'sontheballot.org is my pitch. Easy information. The point is that you still have to win a majority. And, it sort of goes back to the old political machines and why they were so important. And when they incorporated new immigrants into the political process, there was a lot of negative stuff going on, but they understood that if they could do that, they could actually push out, mayors and presidents all across the country by organizing the vote, and that ultimately in elections, you need individual votes, and that rich people have only one vote. I mean, they try and obviously put together more than that. But bottom line is that you have to work hard to organize individual votes into this winning coalition, and that votes count. I mean, they do in the context of elections. And that is my view of why the Republicans are working so hard to suppress the vote, because the winning coalition without suppression is on the Democratic side right now. And so I want people to bear that in mind, that there's lots of work to be done there. So there's work to be done around the vote, and people need to do that work. And then quickly on Bradley's point, we don't, didn't really talk much about social media, but he mentioned communication. That's the other thing that's going on that's extraordinarily transformative to the political process. Part of the reason Trump could be so effective is he used Twitter and circumvented all the old school gatekeeper medias and talked directly to people. And, we know we don't have to go through this whole land of now misinformation that's easily disseminated out there. So I believe that especially in the period between elections is really the frontier for us. The stuff that Bradley was talking about communicating what this means to individuals, because people do not, there are these crazy things where, in the upper Michigan Peninsula, where everybody's on some form of government assistance, whether it's food stamps, Social Security, Medicaid, they vote Republican. And there's some cognitive dissonance going on over there, right? And that information is not coming through in a clear way, right? And it's not just that they're voting for macho guys, right? Which they are. I know that's part of it too. I'm reality-based like that. But in the end, most people do vote their economic interest, but they don't understand it in the same way. And I think we have to get back to forming coalitions about what we have in common, the way Bradley articulated that. I think that is going to be powerful moving forward.
So we only have a few minutes, and I want to ask a final question. I want to hear final thoughts on what do you consider to be either the most relevant question or relevant topics that folks should be focusing on right now?
That was hard. It's a hard question. Wow.
Strong closer.
Yeah, I mean, I may reserve the right to edit this once I hear my panel participants, because they might get me going. But I mean, for me right now, one important question is how to maintain and build upon the positive momentum that just came out of this, what I read as a clear political victory for Biden-Harris, given where they stand on the social welfare policies that I'm passionate about. Now, again, I will say as an aside, we still have to wait to see if this actually comes through. But how do you protect that and build upon that and really kind of solidify those factions? Because I think it got built back. Yeah, I'll stop there.
All right, I'll go next quickly, because I know I took up a lot of time in the last response, but somebody very wise said a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And we are in multiple crises right now, if anybody hasn't noticed. And fortunately, I do believe that COVID is the thing that pulled Biden over the top. It makes me nervous to think about, had the economy been sort of swimming along in the way that Trump was characterizing it, I think it would have been way harder for a Democrat to win the presidency from him. What I think, I guess, what I would like to see is the crises that are magnified around Black Lives Matter and the social movements that emerge from that, the crisis that's magnified around public health and COVID, and of course, the economic crisis that magnifies income inequality in this country in a very significant way, that the public needs to help Biden use these three crises to move the agenda in Washington, both to pass legislation as well as create executive orders and to produce the kind of significant change in the direction of public policy that a moment like this should produce.
Yeah, and I can't pick one thing, but I guess it would be, I'm sticking very individualistic in this, and I guess it would be that that many many of us who consider ourselves to be progressive minded, democratic academic liberals, think deeply about what policies we want to see changed in support of a larger and more inclusive electorate, and what it means to achieve that, what we would have to give up in order to achieve that. Because I think individuals need to ask themselves that question and actually find ways to get to that before we're going to see the large scale changes that are required to be able to get there.
Thank you all. It's clear we have a lot of opportunity here as we move forward. I just want to thank both our panelists and our attendees, and remind you that this is just the first in a 3-part series. The Office of Professional Excellence will be reaching out to all of our registrants and attendees with follow-ups on both CE credits where applicable, as well as for our future events. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Fuchs, Dr. Hardy, and Dr. Witte. It has been an honor and a pleasure for this conversation today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Take care,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.